What I'm about to tell you happened in a small village in the Italian Alps, just outside of Bolzano, back in 2018. And if you've ever spent time in the old mountain towns of northern Italy, you know they're beautiful, sure, but they're also old. Really old. The kind of old where buildings have stories, and not all of them are good. This story's about Marco, an Italian-American guy, mid-30s, who decided to reconnect with his roots. His grandmother had passed away the year before, and in her will, she left him something unexpected. A small stone cottage in the village where she grew up, a place called Valdurna. Marco had never been there. His grandmother rarely talked about it, actually. But now he owned property there, and he figured, why not? Take a month off work, fix the place up, maybe sell it, maybe keep it as a vacation spot. Either way, it was an adventure. So in October, right when the tourist season was winding down and the first snow was starting to dust the peaks, Marco packed a bag and flew to Italy. He rented a car in Bolzano and made the drive up into the mountains. The roads got narrower, the trees got thicker, and eventually, he pulled into Valdurna just as the sun was setting. The village was small, maybe 200 people, if that. Stone houses with wooden shutters, a single church with a bell tower, one tiny grocery store, and a bar where the old men gathered to drink grappa and play cards. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stand out immediately. Marco found the cottage easily enough. It was on the edge of the village, backed up against the forest. The key was waiting for him at the bar, just like the lawyer had arranged. The bartender, an older woman named Signora Claudia, handed it over with a tight smile. "You're Angela's grandson," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Marco replied in his broken Italian. "Did you know her?" Signora Claudia nodded slowly. Everyone knew Angela. "Sweet girl, it's good you're here. The house has been empty too long." There was something in the way she said it. Not welcoming exactly. More like relieved. Marco thanked her, grabbed the key, and headed to the cottage. The inside was dark and smelled like old wood and dust. He found the light switch, and a single bulb flickered on in the main room. It was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading up to what he assumed was the bedroom. The furniture was old but sturdy, covered in white sheets. Everything felt frozen in time. He dropped his bags, opened a few windows to air the place out, and decided to explore the upstairs before it got completely dark. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed. At the top was a short hallway with two doors. One was the bedroom, small but clean, with a wrought iron bed frame and a wooden armoire. The other door was locked. Marco tried the handle a few times. Definitely locked. He made a mental note to ask Signora Claudia if there was another key. But for now, he was exhausted. He went back downstairs, made himself a simple dinner from the supplies he'd picked up in Bolzano, and crashed on the couch. That first night, he slept fine. No dreams, no disturbances. Just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional creak of old wood settling. But the second night, that's when things started. Marco woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind. But as he lay there listening, he realized it was too rhythmic for that. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs, from the locked room. He sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Silence. He waited, listening hard. Nothing. Maybe he'd imagined it. Old houses make noise, right? Especially in the mountains. He lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, Marco went back to the bar. Signora Claudia was there, wiping down the counter. He asked her about the locked room. "Is there another key? There's a room upstairs I can't get into." Her hand stopped mid-wipe. She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "That room stays locked." "Why?" "Because your grandmother wanted it that way." Marco frowned. But I own the house now. I should be able to access all of it. Signora Claudia set down her cloth and leaned in closer. Listen to me, boy. Some doors are locked for a reason. Your grandmother knew that. You should too. It wasn't an answer, but it was clear she wasn't going to say more. Marco left the bar frustrated and confused. What was in that room? And why was everyone acting so strange about it? That night, the footsteps came again. Same time, around 2 a.m. But this time, they didn't stop after a few seconds. They continued, pacing back and forth across the floor of the locked room. Marco grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, crept upstairs, and stood outside the door. The footsteps were loud now, unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Marco pressed his ear against the door. He could hear something. Breathing. Slow, ragged breathing, like someone was standing right on the other side. "Hello?" he called out. His voice cracked. No response. But the breathing continued. Marco backed away from the door, his hands shaking. He went back downstairs, grabbed his car keys, and seriously considered driving back to Bolzano right then and there. But something stopped him. Pride, maybe. Or stubbornness. He wasn't going to be scared off by creaky floors and his own imagination. The next day, he went into the village and found the church. The priest, Father Domenico, was an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face. Marco explained the situation, leaving out the more supernatural details, just asking if he knew anything about the history of the house. Father Domenico's expression darkened. "Your grandmother never told you, did she?" "Told me what?" The priest sighed and gestured for Marco to sit. During the war, the Second World War, this village was occupied. First by the Italians, then by the Germans. It was a dark time. Many people died. Many people did things they regretted. What does that have to do with my grandmother's house? Father Domenico hesitated, then continued. That house, your house, it was used by the Germans as a holding place. For partisans, resistance fighters. They would bring them there, interrogate them in that upstairs room. And then, he trailed off. Marco's blood ran cold. And then what? And then they would take them into the forest. None of them came back. The priest looked at Marco with deep sadness. Your grandmother, she was just a girl then, maybe 16. She lived in that house with her family. They had no choice. The Germans took it over. She heard everything that happened in that room. The screams, the pleading. It haunted her for the rest of her life. When the war ended and the Germans left, she locked that room and swore never to open it again. Marco felt sick. How many people? We don't know exactly. 12, maybe 15. Their bodies were never found. That night, Marco didn't sleep at all. He sat in the living room with every light on, waiting. And sure enough, at 2 a.m., the footsteps started. But this time, there was more. Voices, muffled at first, then louder, speaking in Italian, rapid and frantic. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, pain. And then, a scream, a man's. Scream, cut short, followed by a heavy thud. Marco stood up, his entire body trembling. He had to leave. Now. He grabbed his things, threw them in his bag, and headed for the door. But as he reached for the handle, he heard something that made him freeze. Footsteps, coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, one step at a time. Marco turned around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The beam of light illuminated the bottom of the staircase. Empty. But the footsteps continued, getting closer, reaching the bottom step. And then they stopped. The air in the room changed. It became heavy, cold, like all the warmth had been sucked out. Marco could see his breath. And then, in the silence, a voice, barely a whisper. Perché ci hai dimenticato? Why have you forgotten us? Marco didn't wait to hear more. He yanked the door open and ran. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove. He didn't stop until he reached Bolzano, and even then he kept going, all the way to the airport. He booked the first flight back to the States and never looked back. A few weeks later, he received a call from the lawyer. The cottage had burned down, completely. No one knew how it started. The fire department said it looked like it began in the upstairs room, the locked one. But there was no electrical wiring up there, nothing that could have sparked a flame. The villagers weren't surprised. In fact, according to Signora Claudia, who the lawyer spoke to, they seemed almost relieved. She told the lawyer to tell Marco something. Tell him his grandmother did what she could to keep them quiet, but some doors once opened can never be closed again. Marco never went back to Italy. He sold the land for whatever he could get and tried to forget the whole thing. But sometimes, late at night, when his apartment is quiet, he swears he can still hear them, the footsteps, the voices, and that whisper. Perché ci hai dimenticato? Why have you forgotten us? Now, in Europe, especially in Italy, the memory of the war runs deep. It's not just history. It's still alive in the stories people tell, the ruins that remain, and the silences in certain places. The older generation, they remember. And in small villages like Valdurna, where families have lived for generations, the past doesn't just fade away. It lingers. It waits. Marco's story isn't unique, unfortunately. There are countless homes across Europe, especially in places that saw occupation and resistance during the war, where similar things have been reported. Unexplained sounds, voices, the feeling of being watched. In Italy, there's a belief that trauma can imprint itself on a place, that the emotions, the suffering, they soak into the walls, the floors, the very foundation of a building. And sometimes, under the right conditions, they come back. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. Some places carry weight, and some doors really should stay locked. Our second story takes us north, to the Scottish Highlands, to a place that's as remote as it is beautiful. This happened in the winter of 2020, just before the pandemic really took hold, to a woman named Sarah, a travel blogger from London who made a living exploring off-the-beaten-path locations across Europe. Sarah had built up a decent following on social media. Nothing huge, but enough to get occasional sponsorships and free stays at unique accommodations. Her whole brand was about finding hidden gems, the kind of places tourists don't usually go. So when she received a message from someone offering her a free week-long stay at a restored croft house in the Highlands, she jumped at the chance. The owner, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. MacLeod, explained in his email that the property had been in his family for over 200 years. He'd recently finished renovating it and wanted to start renting it out to travelers. In exchange for a week's stay, all Sarah had to do was post about it on her blog and social media. Simple enough. The location was about 40 minutes from the nearest village, Kinlochue, down a single-track road that wound through hills and forests. Mr. MacLeod sent detailed directions and said he'd leave the key under a stone by the front door since he wouldn't be there when she arrived. He lived in Edinburgh, he explained, and only came up to the property a few times a year. Sarah arrived on a gray afternoon in late January. The landscape was stunning. Rolling hills covered in heather, patches of snow clinging to the higher elevations, and not a soul in sight for miles. The croft house itself was small but charming. Stone walls, a slate roof, and a view that stretched out over a dark loch surrounded by mountains. She found the key exactly where Mr. MacLeod said it would be and let herself in. Inside, it was cozy. A wood-burning stove, a comfortable furniture, a small but modern kitchen, and upstairs, a loft bedroom with a skylight. Perfect for stargazing, Sarah thought. She spent the first day settling in, taking photos and exploring the immediate area around the house. The nearest neighbor, if you could call it that, was at least a mile away, another croft that looked abandoned. But that didn't bother her. Sarah loved solitude. It's why she'd chosen this kind of work in the first place. That first night, she made herself dinner, lit a fire in the stove, and curled up with a book. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you can only get in truly remote places. No traffic, no voices, just the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire. But around midnight, as she was drifting off to sleep in the loft, she heard something that made her sit up. Singing. Faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, singing in what sounded like Gaelic. The melody was slow and mournful, rising and falling like a lament. Sarah climbed down from the loft and went to the window. She pulled back the curtain and looked out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the silhouette of the hills against the night sky. But the singing continued, distant but clear, coming from somewhere outside. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cold. The singing stopped immediately. Silence. Sarah stood there for a moment, her breath fogging in the icy air, then went back inside and locked the door. Probably just the wind, she told herself. Or maybe someone from that other croft, sound carrying strangely over the hills. She went back to bed, but it took a while before she could fall asleep. The next morning, she mentioned it casually in a text to Mr. McLeod. Heard some interesting sounds last night. Is there anyone else living nearby? His response came a few hours later. No. The nearest occupied house is 5 miles south. The croft to the north has been empty for decades. You're quite alone up there. Enjoy the peace. Sarah stared at the message. 5 miles? There was no way she'd heard singing from that far away. But she didn't press it. Maybe she'd been more tired than she realized. Maybe her mind had been playing tricks. That night, she made sure to close all the curtains before going to bed. But the singing came again. Same time, same mournful melody. And this time, it was closer. Not outside anymore. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs. Sarah's heart raced. She grabbed her phone and crept to the edge of the loft, looking down into the main room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the space. And there, standing in front of the stove, was the outline of a woman. She was facing away from Sarah. Wearing what looked like a long dress or robe, her hair hanging loose down her back. And she was singing. That same Gaelic song, soft and heartbreaking. Sarah wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She just stood there frozen, watching as the woman slowly turned around. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The woman stopped singing and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Da mia faithim." I am waiting. Sarah didn't speak Gaelic, but somehow she understood. The woman took a step forward, and Sarah stumbled back, nearly falling. She fumbled for her phone, turned on the light, and when she looked again, the woman was gone. Sarah didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat in the loft with all the lights on, her bag packed, ready to leave at first light. But when morning came and sunlight streamed through the skylight, the whole thing felt surreal. Had she really seen that? Or had it been a dream brought on by exhaustion and isolation? She decided to stay one more night, just to be sure. Just to prove to herself that she wasn't losing it. Big mistake. That evening, Sarah did some research. She looked up the history of the area, the croft, anything she could find. And that's when she came across an old article from a local history website. It was about a woman named Moira MacLeod, who had lived in that very croft in the 1800s. Moira had been married young, to a man who worked as a shepherd. But one winter, he went out into the hills during a storm and never came back. They found his body weeks later, frozen in the snow. Moira, heartbroken, refused to leave the croft. She stayed there alone, waiting for him, convinced he would return. The locals tried to help her, bring her into the village, but she wouldn't go. Eventually they stopped trying, and one spring, when someone finally went to check on her, they found the croft empty. Moira was gone. No body, no sign of where she'd gone. Just her belongings, left exactly as they were. The locals believed she'd walked out into the hills to be with her husband, but her body was never found. Since then, there have been reports, occasional sightings of a woman in the area, always near the croft, always singing that same song, a lament for the dead. Sarah closed her laptop, her hands shaking. She looked around the room, suddenly feeling very, very small. That night, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat by the door with her keys in hand, waiting for dawn. But at midnight, the singing started again. And this time, it wasn't downstairs. It was right outside the loft, on the other side of the wall, close enough that Sarah could hear the intake of breath between each word. She didn't move. She barely breathed. And then, slowly, the door to the loft began to creak open. Sarah didn't wait to see what came through. She grabbed her bag, ran down the stairs, threw open the front door, and sprinted to her car. She didn't look back, didn't stop. She drove straight through the night, back to WWII, and then kept going all the way to Inverness. She left the key at the nearest police station with a note for Mr. MacLeod and booked a flight home that same day. She never heard back from him, and when she tried to find the property listing later, it had been taken down. No trace of it online, like it had never existed. To this day, Sarah refuses to go back to Scotland. And whenever someone asks her about that trip, she just shakes her head and says, "Some places don't want visitors. They're still waiting for someone else." In Scottish folklore, there's a concept called the Bean Nye, or the washerwoman, a type of spirit seen near streams and rivers, washing the blood-stained clothes of those about to die. But there are other spirits too, like Moira, who aren't necessarily malevolent. They're just stuck, trapped between this world and the next, unable to let go of what they've lost. The Highlands are full of stories like this, places where the veil between the living and the dead feels thinner. Maybe it's the isolation, the harsh landscape, the long dark winters, or maybe it's something else, something older. Whatever it is, if you ever find yourself alone in a remote place and you hear singing in the night, my advice: don't go looking for the source. Some voices aren't meant to be answered. Our final story takes place in rural Romania, in the region of Transylvania. And before you roll your eyes, no, this isn't about Dracula. This is something older, stranger, and far more unsettling than any vampire tale. This happened in the autumn of 2019 to a man named David, an American expat teaching English in Bucharest. David had been living in Romania for about 2 years and had fallen in love with the country, the people, the food, the history, all of it. He'd traveled extensively, visited the painted monasteries in Bukovina, hiked in the Carpathians, explored medieval towns like Brasov and Sighișoara. But there was one place he'd been curious about for a long time and had never visited. A small village called Viskri, deep in the heart of Transylvania. It's famous for its fortified church, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and for being one of the most well-preserved Saxon villages in the region. David decided to spend a long weekend there. He booked a room at a guest house run by a local family and took the train from Bucharest to Brasov. then a bus the rest of the way. The journey took most of the day, and by the time he arrived in Viskri, the sun was already setting. The village was exactly what he'd hoped for. Cobblestone streets, colorful houses with tiled roofs, chickens wandering around, and that iconic white church sitting on a hill overlooking everything. It felt like stepping back in time. The guest house was run by an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Popescu. They greeted him warmly, showed him to his room, a simple but comfortable space with wooden beams and handmade quilts, and told him dinner would be ready in an hour. Over dinner, Mrs. Popescu asked about his plans. David mentioned wanting to explore the village, visit the church, maybe do some hiking in the surrounding hills. She nodded approvingly, but then added something that stuck with him. Just make sure you're back before dark. The hills around here, they're not safe at night. David laughed, thinking she was joking. What, are there wolves? Mr. Popescu, who had been quiet up until then, looked up from his plate. Worse than wolves. The old man didn't elaborate, and Mrs. Popescu quickly changed the subject. But David couldn't shake the feeling that they were serious. The next morning, David set out early to explore. He visited the church, walked through the village, talked to a few locals, and took hundreds of photos. By mid-afternoon, he decided to hike up into the hills. There was a trail that led to an old shepherd's hut, abandoned now, but supposedly offering a great view of the valley. The hike was beautiful. The forest was dense, mostly beech and oak trees, and the air smelled like earth and pine. But as David climbed higher, the trees started to thin out, and he noticed something strange. Markers, small wooden crosses, dozens of them, stuck into the ground along the trail. Some were old and weathered. Others looked newer. Each one had a name carved into it, along with a date. David stopped at one of them and crouched down to read it. Ion Vasile, 1987. Another one nearby said, Elena Dumitru, 2003. He frowned. Were these graves? But there were so many, and they weren't in a cemetery. They were just scattered along the trail. He kept walking, and the markers became more frequent. By the time he reached the shepherd's hut, there were dozens of them, forming a rough circle around the structure. The hut itself was in bad shape. The roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. David pushed it open and stepped inside. It was dark, musty, and empty except for a few broken pieces of furniture and some old sheep wool scattered on the floor. But on the far wall, someone had painted something. A symbol crude but deliberate. It looked like an eye, surrounded by a circle, with lines radiating out from it like a sun. Underneath it, in faded red paint, were words in Romanian. David pulled out his phone and used the translation app. Do not look. Do not listen. Do not stay. A chill ran down his spine. He backed out of the hut, suddenly feeling like he was being watched. He looked around, but the forest was empty. Silent. Too silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. David decided it was time to head back. He started down the trail, walking quickly. But after a few minutes, he realized something was wrong. The markers, the wooden crosses, they were different now. The names were different. And there were more of them. Way more. He stopped and looked at one. David Turner, 2019. His own name. His own year. David's heart nearly stopped. He looked at the next one. Same name. Same year. He spun around, and every single marker he could see had his name on it. Panic set in. He started running, stumbling down the trail, branches whipping at his face. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Behind him. Keeping pace. But when he looked back, there was nothing there. The footsteps got closer, faster, and David ran harder. He could see the edge of the forest now, the village just beyond. But the footsteps were right behind him, so close he could feel the presence of something at his back. He burst out of the trees and didn't stop running until he reached the guest house. He slammed the door behind him and stood there, gasping for breath. Mr. and Mrs. Popescu were in the kitchen and looked up, startled. "What happened?" Mrs. Popescu asked, rushing over. David could barely speak. "The trail, the markers, my name. They all had my name." The couple exchanged a look. Mr. Popescu sighed heavily and gestured for David to sit. "We should have told you," he said quietly. "But people don't believe. They think it's just stories." "What stories?" David demanded. Mr. Popescu poured him a glass of palinka, strong Romanian brandy, and pushed it across the table. "That trail leads to what we call the Pădurea Morților, the forest of the dead. A long time ago, maybe 100 years, maybe more, people started disappearing in those hills. Hunters, shepherds, children. They'd go in and never come out. Sometimes their bodies would be found weeks later, but always in the same place, near that hut. The villagers tried everything," Mrs. Popescu continued. "They burned the hut, cut down trees, even brought in priests to bless the land. Nothing worked. So eventually, they just stopped going there. Put up the markers as warnings, each one for someone who was lost." "But I saw my name," David said, his voice shaking. Mr. Popescu nodded grimly. "The forest knows. When someone is marked, it means it's chosen them. It wants them to stay." "That's insane." "Maybe," Mr. Popescu said, "but you ran. You made it out. That's more than most can say." David left Viskri the next morning. He didn't wait for the weekend to end. He packed his things, thanked the Popescus, and took the first bus out. He never went back. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears them, the footsteps, following him, always just a few steps behind. In Romanian folklore, there's a belief in strigoi, restless spirits of the dead who can't move on. But there are also places, forests, mountains, old ruins, that are considered blestemat, cursed. These places have their own hunger, their own will. And once they've marked you, they don't let go easily. The Carpathian mountains are ancient. They've seen empires rise and fall, wars, plagues, unspeakable tragedies. And in the deepest parts of those mountains, in the places where people stopped going generations ago, something lingers, something that remembers. David's story is one of many. Every year, hikers go missing in those forests. Some are found, most aren't. And the locals, they know. They've always known. But they also know that some truths are too dangerous to speak out loud. So if you ever find yourself in the Carpathians, in a village where the old people warn you not to go into the hills after dark, listen to them. Because some places aren't just haunted. They're hungry. These stories, all three of them, share something in common. They're about places that hold on to the past, that refuse to let go. Whether it's a cottage in the Italian Alps, a croft in the Scottish Highlands, or a forest in the Carpathian Mountains, the pattern is the same. Trauma, loss, and death leave marks. And sometimes, those marks become something more. Europe is old, older than most of us can truly comprehend. And in that age, there are layers. History stacked on top of history, each one adding its own ghosts, its own shadows. The land remembers what we've forgotten, and sometimes it reminds us. So the next time you're traveling, especially to the remote places, the ones off the tourist maps, pay attention. Listen to the locals. Respect the warnings. Because some doors really should stay locked. Some voices shouldn't be answered. And some trails are marked for a reason. These stories are based on true accounts. The names and some details have been changed, but the experiences, the fear, the sense that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, Those are real. And they're still happening.